everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
But I think once we get that piece right, I think that gives way to a whole set of new space safety services and sustainability services that are going to form the basis for improved national security, but it's also going to pave the way for the future of the space economy.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Kevin OConnell, former director of the Office of Space Commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce, MIT Media Lab's space-affiliated researcher, and CEO of Space Economy Rising. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Scott. Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Kevin, you've held many U.S. government assignments from within Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, the State, National Security Council, to the Office of the Vice President, and even the Office of the Director of Central Intelligence, to name a few. How would you describe your broader kind of big picture of your career?
So as you cite, Scott, my career has mostly been on the national security side, but I've actually been working on space commercialization since about 1994. And that's been a constant thread in my career. I've gotten to see it from a number of perspectives. I actually ran a national commission on the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, predecessor to NGA. I ran the NOAA Federal Advisory Committee for a number of years, and of course, my time at Commerce, which ended last year.
So, well, first of all, I'm going to ask a kind of a personal question, and then related to exactly the background that you just described, which is kind of that intertwining with intelligence aspects. But first, personally, why are you fascinated with the space commerce as well as just the global space economy?
Well, I'm interested in the space economy specifically because it really is about economics in many ways. It's about all the things. And I left Commerce last year really convinced that the finance and economic aspects were as interesting as many of the technical aspects. I don't have a very deeply technical background. But what I was really very interested in historically were things like finance, regulation in particular. It's actually the topic that I testified at the Second Space Council meeting, and talent and some of the enablers in the space economy, because you need to have all those things oriented the right way to do all the fascinating technical things that people are doing in so many different areas in the space economy.
So we're going to come back to that finance component in just a few minutes, but let's go back to a little bit of your background and trying to cross-intersect space as well. So space is intimately intertwined with the international intelligence as well as our U.S. national security. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Space has been a jewel in the crown for our U.S. intelligence capabilities, for our national security capabilities. You can go back to the early days of the photo reconnaissance programs, and you see how it actually changes the dynamics of how we think about the world and provides strategic advantage then in the Cold War, but it's much the same even today in a very, very different world. And so that has always been a constant in American history for sure. And so we're going to continue to take advantage of that. Obviously, in the world events that we're living through today, we also now see a tremendous contribution by commercial capabilities that provide a whole other dimension to national security.
In your opinion, what are some of the biggest concerns when it comes to the area of space?
So the one that I have spent every minute of the day worrying about for now many years is the space sustainability issue. I actually provided congressional testimony just this week on the topic to move the SSA, Space Situational Awareness capability, over to the civil side. It's done today by the Department of Defense, and there are lots of good reasons to move it to the civilian side. Sustainability here is critically important. The top priority is improving space safety. And what does that mean? It means that we need to improve the timeliness, accuracy, and precision of warnings that go to space operators. There are many objects in space, as many as 130 million under 10 centimeters, and a smaller number above that are larger. Those are trackable, the larger pieces, but the smaller pieces are very difficult to track. And imagine if you were to get on an airplane at the airport, and someone would say, "We're going to fly through a whole bunch of debris, some of which we won't even know is coming your way." You'd think twice about that. And so what's happening is all the space activities that we're doing today have to take place in an environment where there's debris in space from literally every single thing that has flown since 1957. And so we have to pay attention to the safety aspects, and ultimately we have to pay attention to the sustainability aspects. That's very much a top priority here right now.
So the issue that you're describing is only going to get worsened because of the fact that Starlink and many others with their own set of ambitions are going to deploy hundreds of thousands of constellations of satellites in the LEO and maybe even some in the GEO as well. How does that really magnify the issue, and what specifically are things being done on the regulatory framework side to help address some of these things that I think for the most part the industry is trying to self-absorb and internalize in terms of some of the way that satellites decommission and essentially, deorbit itself?
Well, so you're absolutely right. The problem continues to get worse, and I have sometimes not so playfully described it as the speed bump on the pathway to the trillion-dollar space economy, because it is the one thing that affects, for example, the lives of the astronauts aboard the International Space Station. It affects the billions of dollars of investment already made by both the government and private investors, as well as those of our allies. And it also then, potentially impedes the growth of space commerce. And so in our toolkit to deal with that, and by the way, there's a tremendously interesting commercial sector that's emerging in this area as well, in parallel to government efforts. But on the regulatory side, there are 4 tools we have to deal with space sustainability. The very first one, and the least expensive, if you will, is not to create new debris as you put new objects in space. So there's a lot of very interesting research on the ground in terms of new kinds of propulsion, new kinds of metals, new kinds of protective gear and things like that that'll avoid the creation of new debris as we go into space. The second, the one I've spent most of my time on, is the space situational awareness, just improving our understanding of where things are in space and how they behave relative to one another. One of the problems we have today is that operators are getting many, many, many warnings. And, I know from my intelligence background, to cross the street back in that direction again, people who are faced with a continuous set of warnings typically do nothing. And that's not the right answer. What you want to do is to provide warning effectively when someone really is at risk, as opposed to have them deal with a flood of warnings. Last November's Russian ASAT test actually created a series of what are called squalls, conjunction squalls, which operators now have to deal with. The third thing that we can do in space is better traffic management, coordinating between space operators so that they can communicate with one another when there's a risk of collision, and that's what conjunction actually means. And then the fourth one that we can deal with here is active debris removal. That's an emerging market segment. There's a lot of consideration right now for encouraging the market for debris removal. It's complex technically, and it's also complex legally because you're not supposed to touch somebody else's junk without their permission. And so we do have a number of tools available to us, but it's something we have to make a top priority right now.
Well, I'm all too familiar with a lot of these nuances, and certainly there's a lot of advancements in terms of technologies that's happening. And the challenge with certainly the grab and secure aspect is that it's great for larger pieces or debris, but the smaller ones, you have to address it in a different way, including thermal and other types of radiation ways to essentially melt it. Now, transitioning back to the intelligence side, the Ukraine and the Russian war has exacerbated the security concerns and supply chain issues, including component availability of such things as propulsion rockets that we used to depend on from Russia, for instance. Absolutely. How is that affecting how we look at space?
So I think it's a much larger discussion we can have about the total impact. I think on the one hand, we are seeing supply chain concerns that are really an extension of supply chain concerns we had even before the war began. and we can talk more about that. But we're also seeing commercial capabilities make an extraordinary contribution on the war. The contribution for providing communications to folks in Ukraine and elsewhere. The insights created by remote sensing. There's really a lot of contributions. I think there are key questions, as there would be in any democracy. There are key questions about the public-private nature of this and the different ways to think about that, and issues of protection. We have a recent case of the government talking about providing some evidence on the Russian jamming and cyber attacks on Viasat. And so we do have to think proactively about those kinds of issues and how the government and the private sector will interact when operating together or independently in time of conflict.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the concerns rising with China. China hasn't been part of the International Space Station Cooperative, and so they've kind of gone on their own and created their own set of ecosystem and infrastructure. And now they have assets on the moon, Mars, and now they have their space station as well. What are the implications to the international space economy?
Well, so we're seeing partnerships emerge. You've mentioned the Chinese partnership with the Russians on a proposed research station on the moon. We also, of course, have the Artemis Accords, and I believe the number is now up to 19 countries that have signed on to the Artemis Accords, a very important set of principles on how we will responsibly and sustainably explore the moon. I think those are very important. And so the extent to which we can execute on those very quickly, that'll be important for geopolitics. We're seeing geopolitics affect, the partnerships on board the International Space Station. And the question is, how can we maintain partnerships, effective partnerships, even when there's geopolitical rivalries, in terms of energy and climate change and debris mitigation, as I mentioned a minute ago. How do we strike a balance with those kinds of partnerships?
Yep. Let's transition to talk about commercialization. When we used to think about space, we used to think that it primarily belonged to the government, NASA, AFRL, DoD, and now the Space Force. How is a private-public market dynamic shifting towards private commercialization?
Well, so most people know that we're roughly at the $500 billion mark for what's described as the global space economy, and that really includes everything. I would caution the viewer, though, that the numbers are soft. I spent a lot of time, even while at Commerce, trying to get the Bureau of Economic Analysis to align space economic statistics with the way we account for for national economic statistics. And, they did a very good job on that. They're continuing on that work because I think the numbers are soft only because they are very hard to calculate. And we could talk more about that if you like. The shift to privatization, though, is one which most people don't realize. Roughly 80% of that $500 billion is fully private activity. And, private activity there is everything from Lockheed Martin to a small group of entrepreneurs in a garage and everybody in the middle. And, the extent to which that is commercial activity, it actually brings commercial practices to the space business. And of course, the first and easy to observe phenomena here is, of course, reusability, as Elon Musk introduced it, now Rocket Labs and others. The next one is going to be orbital servicing, because one thing that these things both do is they're going to change the economics of getting to space and operating in space. And along the way, they're going to bring along, for example, the space insurance industry, which is going to have a lot better data with which to create their risk models for space. And we're going to learn an awful lot by virtue of the fact that this is open and commercial as opposed to in the government. Government activities are still very important, but we're going to see a whole new set of dynamics because we're applying commercial practices to the space business.
So I think you mentioned a few of those potential opportunities, and I'm glad that you brought up insurance, because we certainly believe that the financial services as it pertains to space is going to be a very large market. In addition to that, when we look at kind of the overall infrastructure, there's a lot that needs to be done. I think one way to characterize it is there's about 180,000 miles from Earth to Moon where there's absolutely nothing, no assets really whatsoever. And we need to think about laying the infrastructure for communication, PNT, as well as data infrastructure, and including cloud computing in space as well as on the moon. What are the big things that you're seeing, and where are the investments coming, and who are the ones that's making the investments?
Well, so for you and I have talked about this before. I see 2022 as the year of the lunar economy, and what I mean by that is we're going to see the first landers head to the moon. I think we've already had a couple of examples, folks saying they're going to affirm the attempts to get there this year, and we really see three clusters of activities headed to the moon. You've mentioned some of them already. The first are the infrastructure builders, because we're going to need exactly or most of the same things that we have on Earth on the moon. We're going to need to be able to communicate. We're going to need to be able to navigate. And of course, there's a large set of data required to do all of those things. And so the establishment of the lunar intelligence, if you will, about where things are, how they behave, things like that, those are all part of the infrastructure. Then we'll have the explorers, the landers and the rovers, and people who are going to look for different minerals and especially investigate the water ice question on the moon. And then the third category is a group of folks that are actually going to try to do things differently on the moon than we do them on Earth. And we've talked a recent example of folks putting a data center on the moon to see if we can take advantage of the environment there, the cold environment there, to actually do data center work in a different way. And just recently, there's been an announcement that we've now been able to grow food and plants in lunar soil. So we're seeing people experiment with things like that. And so I'm very excited about the arrival of the lunar economy. It's believed to carry a large amount of weight in the overall estimates of the $1 to $3 trillion space economy over the next 2 decades. So I think that's a very, very important next step. And critical here is the water ice question. Will we be able to use that to get farther out into the solar system in a way that's more efficient than we have to do it today?
So I think one of the questions or discussion that I like to have is, I think we're hearing similar things from different sources, but yet from kind of a mainstream and maybe even those in Congress, their kind of thoughts around why the importance of the moon, and really getting a tangible understanding of why that's really the case and how that's going to transpire. Can you go a little bit more in depth in terms of what does it mean to have lunar ice? What does it mean to use it to extract oxygen, hydrogen, which are critical for propulsion and travel into deeper space? But fundamentally, why is moon so critical for our aspirations for Mars and beyond?
Well, so the moon is critical, because we want to get back there again and live sustainably and understand how to live there sustainably. And all of the things that I've spoken about previously, are key to remaining there sustainably. On the water ice question, the question there will be, to what extent can we use, hopefully, high quality water ice to form the basis for sustainable life on the moon? That would be easier to make use of it there, but then also to use it as potential fuel to get to Mars and beyond, wherever else we'd like to go. So I think, again, that's a critical question. It's also important from a strategic perspective. The sort of the position of the strategic value of being on the moon, controlling what we'll call the cislunar economy. And the cislunar environment is critical from a national security perspective. And we want to be among the first, we want to be the first to get there, but we certainly want to be there before anyone else is able to establish a strategic presence that works against us here in the United States.
So for those that are listening that are not as familiar with some of the frameworks, like the Artemis treaties, as well as some of the frameworks that exist for the moon, how will some of the property rights and ownership work in the moon as cislunar economy, as well as Mars, for instance?
Well, so the Outer Space Treaty forbids an ownership, if you will, of the moon. But obviously, there's a body of law spearheaded in the United States, but also more recently in Luxembourg, Japan, and elsewhere, that will allow innovators to actually go and make use of capabilities that they acquire, that they extract, if you will, from the moon. And so there's really still a lot of work to be done in terms of the legal frameworks for activities on the moon. and beyond, and those are being worked, literally as we speak. They're being worked in the international governance bodies. They're being worked in industry organizations, standard setting organizations, and things like that.
So for mining companies that are very serious about the potential of the moon, including for precious rare minerals, for instance, how should they proceed, and what's the caution? And then, what's going to give them the level of confidence around spending the capex for those exploration and extraction?
Well, again, I think when you look at the Artemis Accords and both the countries and the values that are imparted to them, we want to take advantage of minerals on the moon. We want to allow for innovation to take place. And so we should look for government programs and policies that, in a bipartisan way, are going to continue to encourage lunar exploration and people being able to benefit, entrepreneurs being able to benefit from activities on the moon. We should beware of any other attempt by another nation, to sort of claim ownership of an area, again, which would not be consistent with the Outer Space Treaty. Doesn't mean people won't try it. And we know that in the interim, government regulators and policy people will be thinking explicitly about issues that will encourage that innovation, certainly here in the United States and in the West and in the Artemis countries. And so you need to watch that space carefully. There's in the United States in particular, there's a concept called mission authorization. By law in the United States, there are three functions that exist deeply embedded in agencies: remote sensing and NOAA, FAA for launch for FAA, and then communications for the FCC. And there's so many new innovations coming in space that there's no one set of regulations that governs either most of them or any of them. The other concern is that for those functions that are already in law, the government had a lot of experience before it wrote those regulations with those functions. Today, we see so many entrepreneurs coming forward with new ideas. The government may or may not have a lot of experience in any one of those areas. And so concept of mission authorization, and there's a paper available I can send to you for your colleagues, talks about giving authorization in such a way that allows the entrepreneur to have a fighting chance, as well as balance those interests with safety and security and perhaps others. And so we should look for some movement on a broad-based regulatory regime that is effective in supporting entrepreneurship on the moon.
So I don't think we have enough time to explore this in greater detail, but fundamentally it's an issue of enforcement. So even if there's some reasonable frameworks across international bodies that agree, how will there be actual enforcement and compliance? And what's the ramification if they don't comply? So in the case of a sovereignty, a competing nation that decides to overtake a particular region, for example, for their exploration, research, and eventually terraforming, what arsenal or what do we have at our disposal to counter that?
Well, so obviously you're working with a blank sheet of paper at this point in terms of policy. It's one of the reasons we established the United States Space Force for situations like that where conflict, was unavoidable. And so obviously lots of developments in that area. We probably don't have time to talk about all of those. I think the next few years are going to have to be fraught with a lot of discussions about how we manage these kinds of activities on the moon. And hopefully no one will make as blunt a move as the one you're suggesting, obviously, that will prompt us to conflict early. That will not be productive in any way. And I think the value of the Artemis Accords, and it suggests that those that are not aware, learn a little bit more about them. They're really about the values and the approaches we're going to take, sharing of scientific data, protection of astronauts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are good principles by which we intend to pursue exploration of the moon. We can only encourage everyone else to participate on as equally responsive a basis as those. But we also need to be ready just in case they don't.
Absolutely agree with that. Now, it's hard for us to imagine right now, but at some point, there's going to be quite a bit of development on the moon and Mars. And at some point, it's not just a terraform for R&D and other types of experimentation, but it will actually have its own sort of colony. And eventually that's going to grow into a city. What's the thought around governance in terms of its own treating it like a colony with its own sort of self-governance, for instance?
So I think there's a lot of thinking going on about this right now, a lot of academic thinking, a lot of things folks in the government are starting to think about this as well. And, we know that you like the word colony, I would call it maybe a habitation or a permanent presence. We know that there are people that are thinking about all aspects of life. We tend to focus on the technical ones that will certainly keep us alive, when we're living sustainably on the moon. But there are also a number of people that are thinking about some of the other aspects. How will we entertain on the moon? How will we make sure that people who are living in isolation can do so safely? How can we deal with space medicine? It's another topic that we've talked about. What will medicine be like for people that are living there? What will food be like? What will other things? How will they govern one another? So that is all still an open sheet for us to be working very hard on as we make technical progress for getting back to the moon. And
one of the biggest challenges, and this is an argument that some make, is are we exporting all the challenges and issues that we have created on Earth by simply taking someplace else? So in other words, the principles and Artemis Accord is a beautiful, wonderful framework. But unfortunately, like as on Earth, not all the players are willing to play by the same set of playbook. They're playing a different game, a different strategy. So how do we make sure that as we think about humanity in a kind of a multi-planet, multi-universe context, ensure that we're bringing the right sense of principles and values and whatever this notion of democracy is onto these next habitats and terraforms?
So I think the good news is we have time to think about it. We don't have as much time. A common principle in the space business historically was when somebody floated a new idea, especially a bold idea like moon habitation, would be to say, hey, that's great. That'll come about in about 10 or 20 years. The problem we have is that we don't have that much time in this particular case, especially if we start to land on the moon this year to provide the early infrastructure for doing this. So we really do need active work on this in academia, by policymakers, by people who are going to participate in living there. And again, on the positive side, we want to work with others. We want to talk to others about principles of governance. Obviously, embedded in the Artemis Accords are a series of values. We're carrying our values as much as we're carrying, the way we want to explore the moon. And that's very, very important. On the other hand, we also need to be ready if there's, conflict or an area which we cannot agree to a certain principle of governance.
So broadly speaking, what do you feel like we're doing right in space?
Oh, I think we're doing a lot of things in space. The space economy, as I like to say, the space economy is accelerating and diversifying. We see so many new market segments coming along, people experimenting. Here in the United States, we have the broadest and deepest ecosystem of entrepreneurs who are not only focused on new and interesting ideas on their own, but they can also leverage technologies and entrepreneurship in a dozen or more areas. We also have a financial ecosystem that's become much more sophisticated about how to back those companies at different stages, understanding today much better than we ever did before what it takes to make a good space company. There's still risk in space. Space is still hard. If you listen to General Raymond, that's one of his chief monikers about operating in space. And then the extent to which we're going to do a lot of activities on the moon. We're going to learn an awful lot about exploration, but we're also going to learn a lot about our lives back here on Earth. On the other hand, I think the sustainability issue that I talked about at the top of our discussion is very, very important. It is an urgent problem. It gets worse by the day. And if we're not very, very careful, we can create a large set of problems for ourselves. Again, I see this as an opportunity. There's a market segment for space safety and sustainability that's emerging. I'm working with a number of those companies, but I look at a lot of them based on my interest over the last 4 years. And I see them as highly complementary to what the government is doing. And, the improving our understanding piece of this will also then give way to being able to do things operationally in space, like debris removal, and really open up a path to what I call an emerging space safety industry. There is a historic parallel here that I like to cited in congressional testimony recently, which is when you think about the historic decision to release the military GPS signal, and it gave way to dozens of applications that we use every single day, whether we know it or not. I think that's exactly where we are on the space safety and sustainability issue, that improving conjunction analysis, operators knowing where they are, on their own, but also relative to one another. That's the very first and immediate step in the interest of space safety. But I think once we get that piece right, I think that gives way to a whole set of new space safety services and sustainability services that are going to form the basis for improved national security, but it's also going to pave the way for the future of the space economy.
Well, that's very hopeful, and I'm very excited about that. There was one area that you mentioned before, which is that in space, it's not the usual space companies and backers that's getting involved. It's actually non-space related industries that are actually supporting and actually engaging in actual projects with some of these companies. Can you give some examples of how they're using some of these opportunities to be in space or on the moon, for example, and what's the implication for other industries?
Absolutely. So I think this is one of the most important next waves of innovation we're going to see in the space economy. Things we have seen so far have typically taken place between space companies and other companies, either other space partners or people that were very familiar with space. What we're starting to see now is a new wave of companies that had nothing to do with space. They don't have any natural affinity for space. But what they're starting to do is they're starting to take advantage of the accessibility of space and the lowering costs of getting to and operating in space to try experiments, to try different things. And I would say generally the trio that is right atop the list to start out with is the combination of remote sensing, IoT, and high-speed communications, most, if not all of those from space, to actually learn how they can manage facilities differently, how they can take advantage of those communications to make very, very precise decisions about their businesses in a world where business is globalized. And I really see that sort of non-traditional space community driving the next wave of innovation in the space economy.
Well, certainly for me, I think one of the areas that's very exciting is in the area of pharmaceutical and medicine. And one of the things that we know that is once we're in space, our cells are aging much faster, some say as fast as maybe 10 years. So you can actually start to experiment and see how some of these therapeutics are behaving in some of these aging cells, for instance. So there's a lot of interesting low gravity types of experiments as well from a structure, molecular, and so forth. So we're very excited. And with that, I have been joined by Kevin O'Connell, former director of the Office of Space Commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce, MIT Media Lab space affiliated researcher, and the CEO of Space Economy Rising. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.